It was a volatile time in our nation's history. In 1941, all able-bodied men aged 18 to 64 were required to register for the draft in response to World War II.
It was the nation's first peacetime draft, and over the course of the war, 10 million men would be drafted and then serve. Fox Carolina's Arthur Mondale continues our coverage of South Carolina stories from the battlefield.
I knew I would be drafted. That's a phrase I've heard repeatedly from World War II vets when reflecting on their teenage years finishing high school. It's also something George Reitmeyer told me. He was the right age and classified 1A, available for military service.
When your mother-in-law says that man doesn't have a lazy bone in your body, that tells you. And he doesn't. He just, even now.
George Reitmeyer and his wife Faith have experienced a lot during their 50 years of marriage.
I wish we would have had this card. He loves to travel, and so do I, so that's something we have in common.
They've got postcards, an abundance of albums, and a possible sign where her husband may have caught the travel bug.
I knew that as soon as I graduated, I would be classified 1A.
And he was. This is his draft card, dated September 4th, 1943. Ordered to report for active duty.
I was the right age. They were looking for qualified people in the Army and in any branch of service at that time, and anybody that was able to serve in any way would be called up into service.
With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
It was Christmas Eve, 1944. A 66th Infantry soldier, George Reitmeyer, was heading to the European theater.
We intended to go to the Battle of the Bulge, which had just gotten underway.
He arrived in England before boarding a ship to France.
In order to link up with a convoy that was going across the channel, escorted by naval vessels.
Reitmeyer says when the convoy got less than 5 miles from the port of Cherbourg, France, they all realized the unpredictability of war.
We were almost there, and a German submarine was in the area and managed to put a torpedo into the Leopoldville.
Some of the men on the ship were either killed by the blast or drowned.
We'd been hit by a torpedo, and the water was pouring into the ship, and sooner or later the ship would sink.
Reitmeyer says it was freezing cold, blackout conditions, and chaos that came to an end thanks to a British destroyer. But Reitmeyer needed courage to jump to the British ship's deck.
It's not very clear in my mind just how I did it.
An eye-opening ordeal that wasn't over when he and his men regrouped to proceed with the mission.
We weren't all there. There were some missing. And we didn't know how many, but we found out later.
He estimates over 800 men died that night, the remaining given a different mission: to surround German naval forces who had heavily fortified 2 regions of France.
It would be better just to surround that area and keep them contained where they couldn't do any further fighting until the war ended. So that's what we did.
The Germans would eventually surrender.
They were put into POW camps, and we were finished in that area.
Reitmeyer didn't return home. He served for a time as a combat engineer construction foreman.
During the occupation, I was responsible for quite a few projects to restore normal life in Europe. These people that had nothing and no place to stay.
He calls giving people some normalcy one of his greatest accomplishments during the war, something Reitmeyer shared in letters to his mom.
Nobody wins in a war. A war just takes too much out of everybody.
And therein lies the reason Reitmeyer still has the uniform: photos, articles, and letters, the evidence of freedom.
I think they can learn something about their country and the responsibilities that they have for being able to live in this country.
Now, the U.S. Elective Service System Agency says following World War II from 1948 through 1973, men were drafted yet again to fill military manpower vacancies that still couldn't be filled through voluntary means. Arthur Mondale, Fox Carolina News.